The morning of June 19, 1944. 800 feet beneath the Philippine Sea, Commander James Blanchard peered through the periscope of USS Albacore and saw something that made his blood run cold. The largest, newest aircraft carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy was bearing down on his position, surrounded by destroyers. Her flight deck crowded with aircraft preparing to launch. Admiral Ozawa's flagship Taiho, 37,000 tons of armored steel, believed by her crew to be virtually unsinkable. They had no idea that in the next 7 hours, a single torpedo from a submarine they never properly detected would transform their pride into a funeral pyre. This is not a story about one submarine sinking 3 carriers on a single date. That never happened. But what did happen on June 19, 1944, was something the Japanese High Command could scarcely comprehend. 2 American submarines, operating independently in the chaos of the largest carrier battle in history, managed to sink 2 of Japan's most valuable flat-tops, while Japanese admirals convinced themselves they were winning. The carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, veteran ships that had participated in nearly every major Pacific battle, vanished beneath the waves not because of overwhelming American air power, but because of silent predators the Japanese anti-submarine doctrine never adequately prepared them to face. The confidence that led Japanese admirals to laugh at their prospects that morning would, by sunset, be replaced by a horrified recognition that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of submarine warfare. The story begins not with hubris, but with desperation. By mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy understood it was fighting for survival. The Marianas, Japan's critical defensive perimeter, were under direct American assault. Admiral Ozawa had assembled the most powerful carrier force Japan could still muster. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. It was, on paper, a formidable fleet. But paper statistics concealed fatal weaknesses. Japanese naval aviation had been bled white over 2 years of attrition. The veteran pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor were largely dead. Their replacements had received perhaps a third of the training hours their predecessors enjoyed. The carriers themselves, though impressive, operated with fuel reserves so limited that tactical flexibility had become a luxury Japan could no longer afford. They burned crude Borneo petroleum, unrefined and volatile, because Japan's refining capacity had been systematically destroyed by American submarines cutting supply lines. Yet Ozawa maintained confidence. His plan leveraged Japan's one remaining advantage. His aircraft had longer range than their American counterparts. He could strike the American carriers from beyond their retaliation distance. The land-based aircraft from Guam and other Mariana Islands would coordinate with his carrier planes in a hammer and anvil operation. The Americans, he calculated, would be overwhelmed by converging attacks from multiple vectors. It was an elegant strategy that depended entirely on assumptions about American capabilities that were 2 years out of date. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Ozawa's intelligence apparatus had failed to adequately communicate was the transformation that had occurred in American submarine operations. The United States Navy had solved the torpedo crisis that plagued its early war submarines. The Mark 14 torpedo, which had betrayed American submariners for 18 months with premature detonations, dud warheads, and erratic depth-keeping, had finally been fixed. More critically, American submarine doctrine had evolved. Submarines were no longer relegated to reconnaissance and opportunistic attacks. They were integral components of fleet operations, positioned specifically to intercept Japanese carrier movements. The Americans possessed another advantage that Japanese planning consistently underestimated: the codebreakers. American cryptanalysts had penetrated Japanese naval codes to a degree that allowed Commander-in-Chief Pacific Admiral Chester Nimitz to predict Ozawa's movements with uncanny accuracy. This intelligence enabled the positioning of submarines like Albacore and Cavalla along the projected path of the Japanese carrier force. But intelligence only creates opportunity. Execution requires skill, courage, and an element of chance. Commander Blanchard aboard Albacore was 32 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who had spent the previous year hunting unsuccessfully for targets in submarine-patrolled waters. His boat, a Gato-class submarine displacing 1,525 tons, was designed for exactly this kind of mission. She could dive to 300 feet, maintain 17 knots on the surface, and carried 24 torpedoes. But specifications meant nothing if you couldn't get into firing position. The challenge facing any submarine commander attempting to attack a fast-moving carrier task force was almost insurmountable. Carriers could outrun submarines. Destroyers equipped with sonar and depth charges formed defensive screens that made approach suicidally dangerous. A submarine had one chance, maybe two, before the entire task force adjusted course and left the submarine behind, unable to pursue at submerged speeds. Blanchard had been tracking Japanese fleet movements for days, guided by intelligence reports that indicated a major operation was developing. On the morning of June 19th, at approximately 7:30 in the morning, Albacore's sound operators detected the unmistakable acoustic signature of a large surface force approaching. Blanchard ordered the boat to periscope depth and slowly raised the scope for a quick look. What he saw would have intimidated a less resolute commander. The Japanese formation filled the horizon. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, all proceeding at high speed in a defensive configuration designed to protect the carriers at the center. Attacking this formation would require penetrating multiple rings of escorts, and doing so without being detected until the final moments of the attack run. The odds were poor, but the target was too valuable to ignore. Blanchard began maneuvering Albacore into position, running calculations in his head about where the Japanese formation would be in 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour. He was betting his boat and his crew on mathematical predictions about the movements of ships he could only glimpse for seconds at a time. At 0800 hours, Blanchard identified his target, a large carrier, what appeared to be a Shokaku-class vessel, based on the silhouette and configuration. In reality, it was Taiho, a newer design that Blanchard's recognition manuals didn't include because American intelligence wasn't fully aware of her existence. This wasn't Blanchard's first patrol, but it would be his most consequential. The interwar years had taught Japanese naval doctrine that submarines were secondary weapons, useful for reconnaissance and perhaps opportunistic attacks, but not decisive. This assessment was based largely on World War I experience, where submarines had proven effective against merchant shipping, but rarely threatened major warships protected by escorts. The Japanese had developed anti-submarine warfare tactics, certainly, depth charges, sonar, aggressive destroyer tactics, but these measures were designed to counter the submarine threat as they understood it in 1941. What they failed to anticipate was how rapidly American submarine warfare would evolve under wartime pressure. The Americans had something else, the Wolf Pack, not a formal organization, but an operational concept that concentrated submarines in areas where major Japanese fleet units were expected. Multiple boats, operating independently but guided by the same intelligence, created overlapping zones of threat that Japanese commanders couldn't adequately counter. Ozawa knew American submarines were in the area. His ships had detected Albacore on radar at 0700 hours. A Japanese reconnaissance plane had spotted the submarine on the surface, but Ozawa made a calculation that would haunt him. Rather than divert his course or delay his operation, he ordered his formation to proceed. He assumed, based on Japanese submarine doctrine, that one submarine couldn't seriously threaten a major fleet unit protected by destroyers. Aboard Taiho, Captain Toshio Abe shared his admiral's confidence. The carrier had only commissioned 3 months earlier. She was the culmination of Japanese naval engineering, an armoured flight deck, the first on any Japanese carrier, designed to withstand bomb hits that would cripple conventional carriers, anti-torpedo blisters along her hull, sophisticated damage control systems, multiple watertight compartments. Taiho represented everything Japan had learned from losses at Midway and subsequent battles. She was, her designers believed, practically unsinkable. The crew numbered 2,000 sailors and airmen. Many were veterans, survivors of earlier battles who had been reassigned to this new flagship. They had trained extensively on damage control, firefighting, emergency procedures, but their training, like so much of Japanese naval preparation, was based on assumptions about the nature of warfare that were about to be catastrophically disproven. At 0810, Taiho began launching aircraft for the second raid of the day. The flight deck was a scene of controlled chaos. Deck crews in coloured jerseys manoeuvred aircraft into launch position. Pilots climbed into cockpits. Engines roared to life. The catapult officer signalled, and aircraft began thundering down the deck, one after another, climbing into the tropical sky. It was at precisely this moment that Blanchard made his move. Albacore had worked into position ahead of the Japanese formation. Blanchard had calculated that if he positioned his submarine in the path of the carrier's advance, and if the carrier maintained course, he would have perhaps 30 seconds when the range closed to acceptable firing distance. It was a technique that required nerve. Position yourself in the path of a 30,000-ton carrier moving at 26 knots. Hope she doesn't turn. Hope the escorts don't detect you. Hope your firing solution is accurate. At 0816, as Taiho's forward momentum brought her directly toward Albacore's position, Blanchard's fire control computer failed. The mechanical calculator that generated firing solutions for torpedo attacks stopped functioning at the critical moment. A less experienced commander might have aborted. Blanchard ordered manual calculations. He would fire by eye, using instinct and experience to estimate the carrier's course, speed, and range. He ordered all 6 forward torpedo tubes loaded and ready. This was not standard doctrine. Firing all 6 torpedoes in a single spread reduced your options if the attack failed, but it maximized the probability that at least one torpedo would hit. Given the difficulty of getting into position and the brevity of the firing window, Blanchard chose quantity over flexibility. At 0818, Blanchard gave the order, fire all tubes. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes, each carrying 660 pounds of Torpex explosive, left Albacore's tubes at 3-second intervals. They ran at 46 knots toward a target less than 1,500 yards away. The torpedoes were set to run at a depth of 10 feet, shallow enough to strike above the carrier's anti-torpedo bulge, but deep enough that surface conditions wouldn't cause them to broach. What happened next became one of the most analysed moments of the Pacific War. Japanese pilot Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu had just launched from Taiho's deck. He was climbing through 200 feet altitude when he looked down and saw the distinctive white wakes of torpedoes streaking through the water toward his carrier. Without hesitation, without orders, without apparent consideration for his own survival, Komatsu pushed his stick forward and dove his aircraft directly into the path of one torpedo. The torpedo detonated on impact, destroying both the weapon and the aircraft, and killing Komatsu instantly. His sacrifice eliminated 1 torpedo. 5 remained. 4 of the remaining torpedoes missed astern, their courses affected by the carrier's wake and perhaps by evasive manoeuvring. But the 6th torpedo, the last one Blanchard had fired, struck Taiho on her starboard side, forward, just below the waterline near the aviation fuel tanks. The explosion sent a column of water 30 feet into the air. The impact was visible from other ships in the formation. Aboard Albacore, Blanchard heard the unmistakable sound of a successful hit through the hull. Then he heard something else. The churning screws of destroyers turning to pursue. He ordered Albacore deep, maximum angle on the dive planes, ahead full. The submarine dropped through 100 feet, 200 feet, 250 feet. Above, Japanese destroyers, Wakatsuki and Hatsuzuki, began dropping depth charges. The explosions were close enough to shake loose equipment and send men sprawling. Damage reports came in. Minor leaks, nothing critical. Blanchard maintained a steady course away from the datum point, using the noise of the Japanese formation to mask his own propeller sounds. After 90 minutes, when the depth charges had ceased and the acoustic signatures of the Japanese ships had faded, Blanchard brought Albacore back to periscope depth. The Japanese formation was gone. Blanchard had no way of knowing whether his torpedo had sunk the carrier, damaged it, or merely inconvenienced it. He filed his contact report and continued his patrol. It would be months before he learned what had actually happened aboard Taiho. The torpedo hit had torn open Taiho's hull, rupturing fuel tanks and flooding an elevator shaft. But the damage, initially, appeared manageable. Water was contained to a relatively small area. The carrier's propulsion was unaffected. Taiho continued launching aircraft and maintaining her position in the formation. Captain Abe assessed the damage and concluded his ship could continue operations. Admiral Ozawa, receiving reports on the bridge, agreed. Taiho had proven her engineering. She had absorbed a torpedo hit and was still operational. This was precisely what the armoured carrier design was meant to accomplish. What neither Abe nor Ozawa understood was that the torpedo damage had created a time bomb. The ruptured fuel tanks were leaking refined aviation gasoline and crude petroleum fumes into spaces throughout the ship. Normally, these fumes would be detected and ventilated, but Taiho's damage control officer made a decision that, in retrospect, guaranteed the carrier's destruction. Observing that fuel vapors were accumulating in various compartments, he ordered all ventilation systems turned to maximum and all bulkhead doors opened to disperse the fumes throughout the ship. His reasoning was sound by conventional damage control standards. Dilute the concentration of explosive vapors by mixing them with fresh air. In theory, this should reduce the risk of explosion. In practice, opening all ventilation systems distributed volatile petroleum fumes throughout the entire ship. Every compartment, every passageway, every machinery, space gradually filled with an explosive mixture. Taiho had become a floating bomb waiting for a spark. For 7 hours, the carrier continued operations, unaware that every minute increased the danger. Pilots landed and took off. Engineering crews maintained the engines. Damage control parties worked to repair the torpedo damage. No one recognized that the entire ship was saturated with explosive vapors until it was too late. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, something, an electrical spark, a cigarette, an overheated bearing, we will never know what created an ignition source. The accumulated fuel vapors detonated. The explosion was not localized. It was not contained to the damaged area. The entire ship exploded simultaneously. Witnesses on nearby ships described seeing Taiho suddenly engulfed in fire from stem to stern. The armoured flight deck, designed to protect against bombs, now acted as a lid trapping the explosion force inside the hull. The pressure blew out Taiho's sides. Her hull opened like a flower. Machinery and aircraft and human beings blown into the sea by the force of the explosion. The carrier's back broke. Within minutes, Taiho began her final plunge. Admiral Ozawa and most of the bridge crew were rescued by destroyers, but 1,650 sailors and dozens of aircraft went down with the ship. Ozawa had lost his flagship and his most modern carrier to a submarine he had dismissed as a minor threat. But the nightmare was not over. While Albacore was making her escape, 80 miles away, another American submarine was positioning for an attack on another Japanese carrier. USS Cavalla, under Commander Herman Kostler, had detected the Japanese formation through radio intelligence and sound contacts. Kostler had spent the morning maneuvering for an attack position, frustrated by the speed and evasive tactics of the Japanese fleet. At approximately noon, Kostler achieved what every submarine commander dreamed of, a perfect firing position on a carrier that had momentarily separated from her escorts to recover aircraft. The target was Shokaku, one of the few remaining carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. A veteran ship, battle-tested and respected. Kostler fired 6 torpedoes. 3 hit Shokaku's starboard side in quick succession. The damage was catastrophic. 1 torpedo struck near the forward aviation fuel tanks, directly adjacent to the main hangar. Aircraft that had just landed and were being refueled exploded into flames. Fire spread through the hangar deck with terrifying speed. Shokaku's damage control parties fought the fires desperately, but the ship's fate was already sealed. The torpedo hits had compromised so many watertight compartments that flooding couldn't be controlled. 3 hours after Kostler's attack, Shokaku capsized and sank, taking 1,263 officers and men with her. 2 fleet carriers, sunk by 2 submarines in a single day. The statistical probability of such an outcome was minuscule. Carrier operations were supposed to be conducted beyond submarine threat range. Submarines were supposed to be detected and driven off by escorts. Yet here were two of Japan's most valuable assets, destroyed not by the massive American carrier force that had been the focus of Japanese battle planning, but by submarines that Japanese doctrine had consistently underestimated. The irony was profound. The Japanese had spent decades perfecting carrier aviation. Their admirals were among the world's foremost experts in carrier tactics. Their carriers were superbly designed and built. Yet these magnificent vessels, representing the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering, were erased from existence by a weapons system the Japanese High Command had never properly integrated into their defensive planning. Admiral Ozawa survived the loss of Taiho, but his perception of the battle was fundamentally distorted. Japanese pilots returning from attacks reported devastating success against American carriers. These reports were wildly inaccurate, the result of inexperienced pilots misidentifying targets and exaggerating damage. But Ozawa believed them. He thought he was winning even as his carrier force was being destroyed. The disconnect between Ozawa's perception and reality reveals something important about command decision-making under stress. Ozawa wanted to believe his operation was succeeding. The alternative, that he was losing the battle and his carriers were being systematically destroyed, was psychologically intolerable, so he accepted optimistic reports and dismissed contradictory evidence. This cognitive bias, the tendency to believe information that confirms what you want to believe and reject information that contradicts it, is not unique to Ozawa or to Japanese commanders. It is a universal human weakness that warfare exposes with brutal clarity. By the time Ozawa recognized that his carrier force had been crippled, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was effectively over. The Americans had destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. 400 aircraft lost, pilots that Japan could not replace. The submarine attacks on Taiho and Shokaku, while not the only factor in Japanese defeat, had eliminated a third of Ozawa's carrier strength without the American carrier aircraft even engaging those particular targets. It was a force multiplier that American planners had hoped for but scarcely dared expect. The Japanese admirals' response to these submarine attacks reveals the depth of their doctrinal blindness. Even after Taiho and Shokaku were lost, Japanese anti-submarine warfare procedures did not fundamentally change. Escorts continued to operate on the assumption that submarines were nuisances rather than existential threats to major fleet units. This failure to adapt, to learn from catastrophic losses, was symptomatic of a larger rigidity in Japanese military thinking. Doctrine, once established, was difficult to revise even when reality demonstrated its inadequacy. The submarines that sank Taiho and Shokaku did not operate in isolation. They were products of a system that had learned from failure and adapted with remarkable speed. To understand why American submarines succeeded where Japanese anti-submarine warfare failed, we must examine the evolution that occurred between 1941 and 1944. When the United States entered World War II, American submarines were equipped with what appeared to be an excellent weapon. The Mark 14 torpedo represented years of peacetime development. It incorporated a magnetic influence exploder that would detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking its back. It had a sophisticated depth-keeping mechanism. On paper, it was superior to anything in the world. In reality, the Mark 14 was catastrophically flawed. The torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than their depth setting. The magnetic exploder detonated prematurely or not at all. The contact exploder often failed on impact. For 18 months, American submarine commanders executed perfect attacks only to watch their torpedoes miss, explode harmlessly in a ship's wake, or strike the target without detonating. The institutional response to submarine commanders reporting torpedo failures was denial and accusation. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted the torpedoes worked perfectly. Submarine commanders were accused of missing their targets, of cowardice, of incompetence. This conflict between operational reality and institutional dogma created a crisis that threatened to render the entire submarine force ineffective. But submarine commanders refused to accept institutional denial. They began conducting their own tests. Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Trout dropped torpedoes in shallow water and measured their actual running depth. Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo fired torpedoes at cliffs to test the contact exploder. They documented every failure meticulously. They shared information across boats, building a collective body of evidence that the Bureau of Ordnance could no longer ignore. By mid-1943, under pressure from Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific, the torpedo problems were finally acknowledged and corrected. The magnetic exploder was deactivated. The depth-keeping mechanism was recalibrated. The contact exploder was redesigned. These fixes transformed American submarine effectiveness almost overnight. Suddenly, submarines that had been firing 20 torpedoes for marginal results were achieving kills with 3 or 4 weapons. The learning curve was steep, but by June 1944, American submarine commanders had confidence in their weapons. Blanchard and Kostler knew that if they achieved firing position and launched their torpedoes correctly, those weapons would perform as designed. This confidence, earned through institutional willingness to acknowledge and correct failures, was something Japanese submariners never enjoyed. The Japanese Navy had developed its own advanced torpedo, the Type 95. It was faster and more powerful than the Mark 14, but Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized attacking enemy warships rather than merchant vessels or supporting fleet operations. This was considered more honorable, more aligned with the warrior tradition. Japanese submarines achieved some notable successes. They sank the carriers USS Wasp and USS Yorktown, but they never systematically targeted American supply lines or positioned themselves to intercept American carrier movements the way American submarines did against Japanese fleet units. This doctrinal difference reflected deeper cultural assumptions about the nature of warfare. The Japanese believed that decisive battle between major fleet units would determine the war's outcome. Submarines were tools for facilitating that decisive battle, not independent strategic weapons. The Americans, more pragmatic, used submarines wherever they would be most effective, attacking merchant shipping, intercepting fleet movements, conducting reconnaissance, rescuing downed pilots. There was no warrior code restricting submarine operations. There was only strategic calculation about where submarines could inflict maximum damage on Japan's ability to wage war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By June 1944, this pragmatic approach had created a submarine force that Japanese commanders consistently underestimated. Intelligence reports reached Japanese headquarters, documenting the systematic destruction of merchant shipping. But these reports competed for attention with more immediate concerns about carrier operations, land battles, and strategic defense. The cumulative effect of submarine warfare, the slow strangulation of Japan's economy and military logistics, was difficult for Japanese planners to fully comprehend because it happened gradually rather than in dramatic, decisive battles. The loss of Taiho and Shokaku should have forced a re-evaluation of submarine threat. Instead, Japanese post-battle analysis focused primarily on the air battle, where Japanese pilots had been slaughtered in what American aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The submarine attacks were treated as unfortunate but not fundamentally significant. This failure to recognize submarines as strategic threats rather than tactical nuisances persisted until the war's end. Consider the human dimension of submarine warfare from the Japanese perspective. Aboard Taiho, sailors worked in engineering spaces, maintained aircraft, served meals, stood watches. Most had no idea their ship was saturated with explosive vapors until the detonation killed them instantly. They died without warning, without the opportunity to fight back, victims of an enemy they never saw. The same was true aboard Shokaku. Damage control parties were fighting fires, trying to save their ship, when progressive flooding overwhelmed their efforts. As the carrier rolled over and began her final plunge, men trapped below decks understood they were about to die in darkness, crushed by water pressure, or drowned in compartments they couldn't escape. There is no honor in such deaths, only terror and futility. The submarine commanders who launched these attacks grappled with the psychological weight of killing at such remove. Blanchard never saw the men aboard Taiho. He saw a ship through a periscope, calculated a firing solution, pressed a button. Seconds later, 1,600 men were dead. Kosler's experience was similar. 3 button presses, 3 torpedo launches, 1,263 deaths. The detachment required to view human beings as targets in a mathematical problem took a psychological toll that manifested years later. Several American submarine commanders sought psychiatric treatment after the war for what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically related to the efficiency with which they killed men they never saw. This raises profound questions about the morality of warfare. Is it more ethical to fight face-to-face, where you see the humanity of your enemy, or is the abstraction of modern warfare, where killing becomes a technical problem rather than a personal act, somehow more humane because it reduces individual psychological burden? There are no satisfying answers. War demands killing, and every method of killing damages both victim and perpetrator in different ways. What we can say is that submarine warfare represented a transition to something new, combat at such remove that it resembled industrial process more than traditional battle. The torpedoes that sank Taiho and Shokaku were manufactured in American factories, loaded onto submarines at Pearl Harbor, launched by men who would never know the names or faces of those they killed. It was warfare as engineering problem, death as applied mathematics. Yet there is another perspective, voiced by American sailors who might have faced Taiho's aircraft if the carrier had survived to launch another strike. Every Japanese carrier destroyed meant fewer American pilots shot down, fewer American ships bombed, fewer American sailors burned alive when aviation fuel ignited on damaged flight decks. The submarines shortened battles, reduced American casualties, brought the war closer to conclusion. This utilitarian calculation, that efficient killing of enemy combatants reduces overall suffering by shortening conflicts, is morally complex but strategically valid. The question becomes whether the psychological cost to submarine crews who bore the burden of this efficient killing was justified by the strategic benefits achieved. The technical analysis of why these submarine attacks succeeded reveals several factors that Japanese anti-submarine warfare never adequately addressed. First was the limitation of sonar technology in 1944. Japanese destroyers had sonar, but its effective range was limited to approximately 2,000 yards in good conditions. In the chaotic acoustic environment of a carrier task force, with multiple ships creating noise, sonar effectiveness dropped dramatically. A submarine running silent at slow speed 3,000 yards away was effectively invisible. Second was the difficulty of depth charge attacks against submarines that could dive to 300 feet. Japanese depth charges were typically set to detonate at 50 to 150 feet. A submarine commander who recognized he was under attack could dive below the effective depth charge zone and escape with minimal risk. This required nerve, diving toward crushing pressure while explosions hammered the hull above, but it was survivable. Third was the speed differential. Carriers could outrun submarines on the surface, but submerged submarines running silent were nearly impossible to track once they broke contact. If a submarine successfully dove after an attack, the task force had to choose between stopping to ride iceras, hunt the submarine, or proceeding with the mission. Most commanders chose mission over vengeance, allowing submarines to escape. Fourth, and perhaps most critical, was the intelligence advantage. American code-breaking meant submarines knew where Japanese carriers would be before Japanese admirals knew submarines were hunting them. This allowed submarines to position themselves along projected paths rather than searching randomly. The Japanese never fully grasped how completely their codes had been compromised. They attributed American success to superior technology or luck, rather than recognizing that their most secret communications were being read in real time by enemy cryptanalysts. This intelligence asymmetry multiplied every other American advantage. The aftermath of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was catastrophic for Japan. The loss of Taiho and Shokaku, combined with the destruction of Japanese naval aviation, ended Japan's ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations. Zuikaku, the sole surviving fleet carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, would sink 5 months later at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The carrier force that had once dominated the Pacific was effectively extinct. Admiral Ozawa survived to command Japan's decoy carrier force at Leyte Gulf, sacrificing his remaining carriers to draw American attention while Japanese battleships attempted to attack American landing forces. It was a suicide mission, executed with full knowledge that the carriers had no realistic chance of survival. Ozawa's willingness to sacrifice himself and his ships in a diversionary role speaks to both his sense of duty and his recognition that Japanese naval power had become expendable. The crews who survived Taiho and Shokaku were reassigned to other vessels or land-based units. Many would die in subsequent battles. The survivors carried memories of watching their ships explode and sink, of swimming through burning oil, of seeing shipmates drown or burn alive. The memories, like those of submarine crews who launched the attacks, were not easily reconciled with peacetime existence. Commander Blanchard was awarded the Navy Cross for sinking Taiho. Commander Kostler received similar recognition for Shokaku. Both men continued their submarine careers through the war's remainder, conducting additional patrols, sinking additional ships, but neither ever again achieved an attack as significant as their June 19, 1944 strikes. The submarines themselves, Albacore and Cavalla, survived the war. Albacore was decommissioned in 1946 and eventually scrapped. Cavalla was preserved as a museum ship at Galveston, Texas, where visitors can tour the cramped spaces where Kostler and his crew lived and fought. Standing in Cavalla's torpedo room, seeing the tubes from which the weapons that killed Shokaku were launched, provides visceral understanding of submarine warfare's claustrophobic reality. The strategic impact of these submarine attacks extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by Americans and the Battle of the Philippine Sea by Japanese, marked the point where American naval superiority became so overwhelming that Japanese defeat was mathematically certain. Japan could no longer replace lost pilots faster than they were being killed, could no longer replace lost ships faster than they were being sunk, could no longer supply forward bases because submarines had cut their supply lines. The submarine attacks on Taiho and Shokaku were symptoms of this larger systemic failure. Japan had entered the war with limited resources and a strategy that depended on winning quickly before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized. By mid-1944, that strategy had clearly failed. American shipyards were producing carriers faster than Japan could sink them. American training programs were producing pilots by the thousands. American submarines were destroying Japanese merchant shipping at a rate that guaranteed economic collapse, even if Japan won every surface battle. Yet, Japanese leadership could not acknowledge defeat. The concept of surrender was culturally intolerable. So the war continued for another 14 months, consuming additional hundreds of thousands of lives in battles that changed nothing strategically. The question we must confront is whether the submarine campaign, effective as it was, shortened the war sufficiently to justify its costs. American submarines sank more than 1,300 Japanese vessels, totaling over 5 million tons. They strangled Japan's economy, isolated the home islands, made continuation of the war materially impossible. Yet Japan fought on until atomic weapons demonstrated that continuation meant national extinction. Would Japan have surrendered earlier if submarine warfare had been even more aggressive? Or did the gradualism of economic strangulation actually prolong the war by not forcing immediate crisis? These are counterfactual questions without definitive answers. What we can say with certainty is that by August 1945, Japan was a defeated nation kept on artificial life support by leadership unwilling to acknowledge reality. The submarine campaign had achieved every strategic objective. The question was whether those objectives were sufficient to force surrender without the additional horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The legacy of submarine warfare in the Pacific extended far beyond World War II. The tactics developed by commanders like Blanchard and Kostler became the foundation for modern submarine operations. The integration of intelligence, the emphasis on stealth and surprise, the willingness to position submarines aggressively in enemy-controlled waters, all became standard doctrine. Cold War submarine operations, with nuclear-powered boats capable of remaining submerged for months, represented technological evolution, but tactical continuity with World War II precedents. Modern anti-submarine warfare, with its sophisticated sonar, helicopter-deployed torpedoes, and coordinated hunter-killer groups, developed in direct response to the threat demonstrated by American submarines in the Pacific. The Japanese learned too late that submarines were existential threats to surface fleets. Subsequent navies learned that lesson vicariously. Today, any naval force operating in contested waters must assume hostile submarines are present and must allocate significant resources to anti-submarine warfare. This defensive burden, the necessity of protecting against an enemy you cannot see, fundamentally shapes modern naval operations. For the men who served aboard Albacore, Cavalla, and dozens of other American submarines, the war ended with mixed emotions. Pride in their service and their victories, grief for the 52 submarines lost and the 3,500 men who never returned, recognition that they had participated in one of history's most successful naval campaigns, and perhaps guilt, suppressed but persistent, about the efficiency with which they had killed men who were, in most respects, not so different from themselves. Sailors doing their duty, following orders, trying to survive a war they did not start and could not control. The Japanese sailors who died aboard Taiho and Shokaku were not evil. They were not war criminals. They were young men, most in their 20s, serving their nation as they understood duty required. They died because submarines they never saw launched torpedoes from positions they never detected. Their deaths achieved American strategic objectives, but did not change the fundamental tragedy that warfare inflicts suffering on individuals who bear no personal responsibility for the conflicts that kill them. This is the moral paradox at the heart of submarine warfare. It is strategically effective precisely because it is impersonal. The submarine commander does not see the faces of those he kills. The sailors aboard the target ship do not see the submarine hunting them. Death comes without warning, without the possibility of fighting back, without the martial dignity that traditional combat supposedly provides. Is this progress? Is warfare that reduces individual encounters and increases lethality through technology and coordination somehow better than warfare, where combatants face each other directly? Or have we simply found ways to kill more efficiently while protecting ourselves from the psychological consequences of what we do? These questions have no comfortable answers. What we can observe is that warfare has consistently evolved toward greater abstraction, greater distance between killer and killed, greater reliance on technology and systems rather than individual martial prowess. Submarine warfare in 1944 represented an intermediate stage in this evolution. Still dangerous for the attackers, still requiring courage and skill, but already moving toward the push-button warfare that would characterize later conflicts. The men who fought aboard submarines in the Pacific War occupy an interesting position in military history. They were warriors, certainly, facing death from depth charges, equipment failures, and accidents every day they were at sea. But they were also technicians, operating complex machinery, calculating firing solutions, maintaining equipment in conditions that made every mechanical task difficult. They bridged the gap between traditional naval warfare, where ships closed to gun range and slugged it out, and modern warfare, where engagements occur beyond visual range and success depends on sensors and computers and weapons that function autonomously after launch. Understanding submarine warfare in the Pacific requires appreciating this duality. It was both intensely personal, men living in intimate proximity under constant stress, and coldly impersonal, killing by mathematics at ranges where the human cost was abstract. The psychological toll of this duality explains why so many submarine veterans struggled with post-war adjustment. They had proven themselves brave, they had served effectively, they had achieved remarkable successes, but the nature of their service did not provide the same psychological closure that traditional combat supposedly offered. When you kill at such remove, through such technical mediation, doubt creeps in. Were the deaths you caused necessary? Were they justified? Could you have done anything differently? These questions haunted some submarine veterans for decades. Others compartmentalized their wartime experiences, accepting that they had done their duty in a just cause and refusing to second-guess wartime decisions. Neither response is wrong, Both reflect honest attempts to reconcile the moral complexity of warfare with the human need for meaning and justification. The Japanese sailors who died aboard Taiho and Shokaku left families who mourned them, friends who remembered them, communities that felt their absence. Their deaths were mourned in Japan with the same grief that American families felt when submarines failed to return from patrol. War does not discriminate. It consumes young men regardless of nationality, ideology, or the justice of their cause. This universal suffering, the common humanity of those who die in warfare, regardless of which flag they served, makes the celebration of military victory morally complicated. We can acknowledge that American submarines achieved remarkable strategic success. We can honor the courage of submarine crews who faced terrifying dangers. We can recognize that shortening the war through effective submarine operations likely saved lives overall. But we must also acknowledge the human cost paid by those on both sides, and question whether we have learned anything from this history that might help us avoid similar conflicts in the future. The answer, unfortunately, appears to be no. We have learned to fight more efficiently, but not how to avoid fighting. We have developed more sophisticated weapons, but not greater wisdom about when weapons should be used. Submarine warfare in the Pacific War demonstrated that technological superiority, combined with tactical innovation and strategic intelligence, can achieve decisive victory. But it also demonstrated that such victory comes at human cost that statistics cannot fully capture. 1,600 deaths aboard Taiho, 1,263 aboard Shokaku, 3,500 American submariners lost. These numbers represent individuals, each with names and stories, and people who loved them. The efficiency with which submarine warfare killed should not obscure the tragedy that so many died. Continuing to final section. The morning of June 19, 1944, began with Japanese admirals confident in their strategy and their carriers. It ended with 2 of those carriers on the ocean floor, and that confidence revealed as fatal delusion. The submarines that achieved this outcome were not magical. They were well-designed machines operated by well-trained crews, guided by excellent intelligence, and armed with reliable weapons. The formula was simple, but simple is not easy, and the combination of factors that made American submarine warfare so effective took years to develop and came at significant cost. The Japanese never developed equivalent submarine effectiveness because their doctrine never prioritized the kinds of operations at which American submarines excelled. This was not primarily a matter of technology or courage. It was doctrinal blindness rooted in cultural assumptions about honor and appropriate targets. The same mindset that made Japanese soldiers willing to fight to death rather than surrender made Japanese naval officers reluctant to employ submarines against merchant shipping or in fleet support roles that were considered less prestigious than attacking enemy warships. This doctrinal rigidity, the inability to adapt strategy when reality demonstrated that existing approaches were failing, characterized Japanese military leadership throughout the war. The contrast with American military culture is instructive. American submarine commanders challenged institutional dogma about torpedo effectiveness and eventually forced the bureaucracy to acknowledge and fix the problems. American naval doctrine evolved rapidly in response to operational experience. American leadership was willing to employ submarines wherever they would be most effective, regardless of whether such employment fit traditional concepts of naval warfare. This pragmatic flexibility, the willingness to abandon tradition when tradition led to failure, was perhaps America's greatest strategic advantage. Not technology or resources, though those mattered, but the cultural capacity to learn from mistakes and adapt faster than the enemy. The submarines that sank Taiho and Shokaku represented this adaptive capacity made lethal. They were the products of an institution that had failed catastrophically in early war operations, acknowledged those failures, corrected them, and created something devastatingly effective. The Japanese admirals who laughed at their prospects on the morning of June 19th were not fools. They were competent professionals operating within a strategic framework that made sense given their assumptions about American capabilities and their own doctrine. Their tragedy was that those assumptions were wrong, and that Japanese institutional culture made recognizing and correcting such errors nearly impossible. By the time Japanese leadership understood that their carriers were desperately vulnerable to submarine attack, it was too late. The carriers were gone. The pilots were dead. Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations had been destroyed. The submarine attacks were not the only factor in this outcome. American carrier aviation inflicted devastating losses. Japanese training deficiencies meant replacement pilots were inadequate. Fuel shortages limited tactical flexibility, but the submarine attacks removed 2 carriers from the battle without the American carrier force even engaging them. This force multiplication, achieving strategic objectives through unexpected vectors, characterized American operations throughout the Pacific War. The Japanese planned for the battles they expected. The Americans fought the battles that would win the war. This difference, more than any technological or numerical superiority, explains why the outcome was never seriously in doubt after mid-1944. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.